Welcome to the Korea Society. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the president of the Korea Society. And in today's program, we will discuss how North Korea's marketization has affected economic development in the country, governance, and society. With us today on the right here, my right, is Yonho Kim. He is a non-resident fellow at the Korean Economic Institute. Like me, he's a graduate of Johns Hopkins SAIS, and he also studied international relations at Seoul National University. Andray Abrahamian is a Stanford University visiting fellow, and in his very interesting background, he worked for something called the Chosun Exchange and has visited North Korea more than 30 times. So we'll have this moderated discussion, and then we'll open up for Q&A. But before I begin, I should make the announcements for next week, right? So next week we have a program on Thursday at 6 p.m. It's called Trauma Care and North Korea. It's a medical program. And this will examine how marketization has affected the medical system in North Korea. And for that, we are joined by a Harvard Medical School global surgery scholar, Key Park. So why don't we kick off? So my first question is, how and when did North Korea, the Stalinist state, begin to marketize? What was driving this marketization process? Andray, you want to?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of literature about it. It was a result of the collapse of the economy in the mid-1990s and the subsequent famine that took place. So a bottom-up coping mechanism that ended up becoming institutionalized. The state in the 2000s made a couple of attempts to adjust to this new reality, but with quite a bit of ambivalence. And then under Kim Jong-un, I think, more interestingly, there have been more proactive top-down measures to institutionalize and formalize a lot of the things that are taking place already.
Right. These top-down measures are not well explored or discussed. The phrase with North Korea is marketization from below, right? And so what exactly is going on from the top down? I mean, what type of measures is Kim Jong? This is all occurring under Kim Jong-un, right? Or has occurred under Kim Jong-un. What's he doing? What's he attempting to do?
I think it started around 2010-11, following a failed currency reform of 2009. More technocrats were put back into positions of influence, and they first allowed Rajan Songbong, this SEZ in the far northeast that borders Russia and China, more autonomy, more capacity to experiment. Then in the 2 years after, they rolled out a number of new SEZs. There's something like 26 altogether now dotted across the country. And also a series of reforms that they called our-style economic management. And under these new rules, basically, state-owned enterprises now have to run on market principles. So the command economy has become much smaller, and companies now... So under the old system, if I was running a shoe factory, I would expect the state to provide me most of my inputs and then take most of the shoes that I would make. I'd give them back and they would distribute them as they saw fit. Now I have to find the material for the laces, I need to find the rubber for the soles, and then I need to find markets and to find people to buy my product.
Right.
And they really formalized that in 2012-13.
Right. But these are only for small-scale businesses. There's no attempt to have a...
No, these are state-owned enterprises as well as smaller.
Right,
smaller
but can
ventures.
in this new market system in North Korea, can there be a large company that could be a rival to a state-owned enterprise? Does that happen?
I think a large company at some point becomes a state-owned enterprise. So this is something I think we should emphasize today that is extremely messy. I've said that they have formalized a number of the rules, a number of the things that take place in the market economy, but there's still much that happens in a gray area. So at some point, let's say I've started a small shoe factory and I've got 10 employees and then 20 and then 30, and then 50. At some point, really at every level, I need to be making sure my relationship with the state and certain key entities is positive. And at what point do I, as the individual manager or owner of this enterprise, become a state-owned enterprise? And really, how does the state control what I do? Those questions are difficult to answer, and I think vary a lot.
Okay, good.
Can I add?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Bottom-up aspect of marketization. So at the beginning, I think it's all about survival of the people. Before the arduous march in the 1990s, the state actually dominated the food distribution, keeping people immobile and heavily reliant on the government for fear of losing their only access to daily sustenance. But when you're facing this massive famine, you have to change your mind. But those who kept, holding onto the hope in the socialist welfare system, they failed to survive. And my Defectors interview said, in their words, those naive rabbits and sheep failed to survive, whereas the cunning and strong foxes successfully, taking care of their lives and their family. So that tells a lot. And government officials, when everybody is seeking their own self-interest for their survival, taking bribe is another, good excuse for them as a means of survival. So when they're turning their blind eye to their so-called illegal market activities, basically encouraging market activities in the country.
Right. So there's this like complete laissez-faire situation in North Korea, it seems, where you can operate down below. The government doesn't come in and interfere or attempt to suppress this market activity as it did maybe under Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il. Is that correct? Is it like kind of hands off this market activity?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, under Kim Jong-il, the regime just went back and forth between regulation and the tolerance over market policies. But Kim Jong-un, he has been consistent in terms of his leniency on market activities. And he is basically trying to fully utilize the market. And for example, I mean, based on my research on the logistics system in North Korea, at least since 2014, there has been no known large-scale crackdowns on servicha, private vehicles for profit in North Korea. And even there was kind of a concern, at least for a short period of time, over kind of oversupply of servicha among the servicha operators. So that tells a lot about Kim Jong-un's
Please
policy.
tell us what servicha means.
Servicha is combination of service and cha, meaning car in Korean. So service car. It's really interesting that North Korean people are using this English word when they're supposed to just oppose the idea of the Western style of culture invading their society. But anyway, servicha is a really widely used term for their kind of private transportation tools.
Right. But we're not at the point yet where, say, China was in 1992, where the reforms were stalling up in Beijing and with the Communist Party, and Deng Xiaoping went down south and kind of kick-started the decentralization process with the "to get rich is glorious." I mean, is there any quote from Kim Jong-un where he tells, the next question is the Donju, who are the Donju and what role do they play? Has Kim Jong-un encouraged the Donju to become rich and it's glorious to be rich?
There's still much more ambivalence in North Korea than there was in China or in Vietnam as they embarked upon their process of reform. So we haven't seen Kim Jong-un in the media going to one of these markets and going to market stalls that are run by individual women and their families. We do see him going just, I think, last month to a brand new refurbished department store in Pyongyang, in East Pyongyang. But we have yet to see him endorse sort of low-level market activities. He has left them alone, as Yonho mentioned,
Right.
but that's not quite the same.
Right.
And then further up the scale, donju is a concept that I think is thrown around very liberally by commentators and media. I think partly because everyone can pronounce it, in English. It's not like Ryomyong Street or something that's very difficult and ugly to write. It's simple. It is an elegant concept if you don't think about it too hard. It's just, what is it? It's rich people, or is it middle-class people with disposable income who can start companies? Are you a donju if you can start a restaurant or buy a truck to do logistics? Or are you a donju if you can build a building and split profits with the state? I think we also overuse the term elites when we talk about Pyongyang as well. Often people say, oh, Pyongyang elites, their interests are very much with the state because they live in Pyongyang, they're privileged. There's Pyongyangers that are incredibly poor, and then there are middle classes who can, say, afford a taxi or go to a nice restaurant, and then there are a handful of very rich people. So one thing we do, I think, too often is we ignore classes in Pyongyang and in the country and ignore what their class interests might be. Because sometimes they're very much in line with the state. They're protected by the state. They're privileged. Other times what they want is in opposition to the state. So, the nuclear program and sanctions, that's bad for business. So, you would want your government to go in a different direction.
Right.
But what we tend to do is flatten all these different classes out. And I think that obscures the complexity and messiness.
The way we've looked at it here, we've translated donju, which means literally money master, but not like masters of the universe, maybe master of a house or something like that, as entrepreneurs. So this is what they do full time rather than being a bureaucrat or a university professor or something like that, a doctor, whatever.
Right.
Is that close to the mark of how you would define a donju?
I would like to just abandon the term entirely, I think, at this point.
Okay.
I mean, are we talking about, say, 10,000 people in Pyongyang who really have millions of dollars at their disposal to push major projects? I guess I quite like that definition. Somebody who runs a factory, like a cottage industry with 10 people, I mean, they're, by North Korean standards, doing very well, and will have some influence with their local government, perhaps. But are they donju?
Yeah.
I don't know. We should.
All right, do you agree with that?
Concept away.
Yeah, I agree
Yonho?
with Andray.
Sweet.
When it comes to donju, they're rich people basically. But if you want to know exactly who they are, it's really tricky. Donju, sometimes they're wives or relatives of state officials. So how can you define them and put a clear demarcation line between them, your husband and wife, right? And as Andray said, donju, for their business, they mostly associate themselves with the state institutions. For example, if they want to run their private transportation business, they have to register their vehicles with state institutions because the private property rights is denied in North Korea. So to operate their business legally, they should be protected by state institutions. And the more they want to be successful, the more powerful state institutions they want to get associated with.
Yeah. Okay.
I've taken officials down to Singapore to study economic policy.
This is the Chosen Exchange.
Yeah,
maybe we can
with
get into
Chosen
that a little
Exchange.
bit, yeah.
And in the same group of these officials, mostly from the Ministry of Finance, there'll be people that are well-heeled and have nice suits. One wonders what their wives or parents, what kind of resources they have. And another official, his carry-on baggage was two, plastic Safeway bags. So, are they of the same class? Do they have the same interests, class interests? I don't know.
Yeah. So a lot of almost all of what we know about North Korea is what we glean from defectors, right? Except for your 30 visits, there you can see things with your own eyes. But do the defectors, when they come down south, when they're asked what was your occupation up north, do they say I was a donju? Do the North Koreans recognize that term?
Not really. I mean, I have a limited number of defectors that I interviewed. They just boast of how wealthy they were. Like I ran like millions of dollars, but not really identify themselves as Tonju.
Right.
But let me add this thing. When it comes to Tonju, I mean, they make a lot of profit in investing in every sector where market works. But one thing I found really fascinating about their business is private money transfer. It originates from the North Korean people's deep distrust in the official banking system. And Donju, they just making profit from that imperfect system in North Korea. And because they're running, as Andray said, more than millions of dollars, that's where their capability of functioning as like a remittance house coming from. And it's really advanced financial service in North Korea, which demonstrate how large role the Donju plays here.
If you use the word in North Koreans will usually say, "Oh, you know that word?" And if you ask, "Oh, is that built by Dongju?" They will say, "Oh, you know that word," and then not answer you. That's usually how it goes. So everyone uses the term. Maybe it's like elites in our society. Nobody really self-identifies as an elite, but you can point one out, right? Not far from here.
All right.
Possibly in this room.
All right. So to jump to the question, this reform from below. Yonho, you've done some research on logistics and communications. Could you summarize some of your findings on that?
Yes, really hard to summarize in 1 minute, but I wrote two research papers on that. But cell phone, the market has seen a dramatic growth in subscribers in North Korea since late 2008 when they introduced a 3G service. It's now estimated the number of subscribers around 5 million, meaning like 4 out of every 10 North Koreans theoretically are using cell phones. And cell phone is kind of lifeline for the merchants now. You can't imagine doing business without cell phone because you need to collect the market trend information and negotiate the delivery or shipping methods or even prices and quantities to be traded. So without cell phone, you're just far behind among your competitors. And because of this private transportation services combined with cell phone service in North Korea, you're now seeing a kind of logistics revolution. In the past, people just carry the goods with themselves, traveling long distance. So you have a limited amount of goods you can carry. But now, with cell phones and private transportation service, you can do your business by just sitting at home. So they call these kind of merchants stay-at-home merchants. So all you need is the cell phone numbers of your business partners. So wholesale, retail merchants, truck drivers, brokers, and you just need to make sure they're doing their job. You have a division of labor or role assignment here. And that's why we have a kind of a logistics revolution, not exactly what we have in this country like UPS, FedEx, but good enough for the North Korean standard.
Right. Maybe Amazon will be interested in having some joint ventures there.
And competing with each other too, right? Different logistics companies or individuals will have to compete with others, right?
Competition is a really important factor there. And probably because of that, and again, the technology. When I interviewed North Korean defectors, they just kept using this word credibility. In the past, like Changmadang is well known for its reputation, if you will, as the hotbed of fraudulent activities. And there was even a running joke that if you get back your money that was lent to somebody else, you're a hero of the People's Republic. So there's no credibility-based business going on in the past. But now, if you lose credibility by failing to do responsible business practice, you not only lose your business relationship with specific clients, but also the whole community of the merchants.
Right.
For example, if you're a truck driver and delivering certain goods, you're supposed to call the shippers and recipients once every few hours at least, and let them know about your location and the estimated arrival time. If you fail to do that, you can't do business anymore with them. So
Yeah.
credibility is really
Beginning
important.
of a credit culture in North Korea, perhaps. You also mentioned something interesting. So this is marketization from below. There's no banking system in North Korea to speak of. People still distrust the banks, right? The Donju don't go up to the Chosun, Jungan, Unhang and deposit their money there. They keep it under the mattress, under the yo. But there's another unit of exchange and store of value. That's the cell phone minutes, right?
Right.
You were talking about that, how payments were made in cell phone minutes.
Right. This is really interesting practice that I found among North Koreans. So probably this is because the 3G service was introduced by this Egyptian telecom company, Orascom. So in Africa, as you may know, like a long time ago, when they started the cell phone service, there was a package service, and that included airtime, cell phone, call minutes transfer. And people use this, call minutes as a proxy for money. So if you want to send, in North Korea again, send a gift to your friends, or even bribe the supervisor of your son who is serving the military, you just need to send the airtime to the person, and when they get it, because the airtime is so precious asset in a service, you can use it yourself, or you can resell it to professional airtime traders. So there is obviously a kind of a secondary market going on. And nowadays, I was told that the merchants, when they're just negotiating and came up with a fixed price, then they can just, if the price amount is small enough, they can just send the airtime instead of giving cash on spot.
Right, good. I wanted to get to the role of foreign investment, but before I got there, I just wanted to follow up on this, the Chosun exchange activities that you were involved in. So, who were these people getting trained and exposed to Singapore? How Singapore works, and what organizations did they come from, and what did they do when they got back? Do you have any idea of whether their knowledge was being institutionalized in Pyongyang?
Well, it's hard to claim credit. I think altogether Joseon Exchange has brought about 100+ people abroad for study trips, and has trained several thousand now in Pyongyang. I think our programs have fed into a lot of the changes that have taken place in the last few years. And program participants vary. If it's a business skills program, then it will be entrepreneurs and managers of companies. If it's more about economic policy, then ministry officials and academics. One doesn't want to take too much credit, but I think we see ourselves, or I've left now, so they're feeding into these changes. And one of the key changes that took place was in 2014 when they amended their Enterprise Act. And I think that's also very illustrative of some of the challenges facing Donju, or whatever we're calling these people. That the new version of the act allows basically for private investment into state-owned enterprises explicitly.
Right.
But property rights have still not been encoded into law, and the ways in which a private investor can legally withdraw profits or remunerate to other institutions is also not clear. So you still come up against these limits that make it very hard to do business. And then I think the other key limit that they haven't really been willing to push on is mobile communications with the outside world. That's still a huge fetter, and they haven't really loosened up how the difficulty with which North Koreans communicate with the outside world.
Okay, so these are some of the challenges North Koreans face in investing in North Korea, their own country. What about foreigners? What role are they playing? The Chinese, or else the special economic zones? Are they? I know that we'll get into the question of sanctions too, but how active were foreign investors until the sanctions tightened up in, say, 2016, 2017?
The investment environment is dominated by Chinese businesses. I mean, dominated. The examples of non-Chinese investment really are.
Are these individual
very
Chinese, or are they local governments in China? Are they investing in North Korea?
They are small and medium-sized companies. So the big players are not really involved. You know, a bit more cautious, waiting for the political signal that it's time to go in en masse. And so it's smaller companies, willing to tolerate a bit more risk. And indeed, one thing in researching the Tumen Triangle, where North Korea and China and Russia meet, I learned that Russians are much more risk averse than Chinese. It seems like there's a bit of a roll the dice kind of mentality for a lot of Chinese investors. I don't know if any of you have seen casinos around the world, Chinese gamblers, a little bit like that, very, very intense, somewhat reckless, you might say. But still, enough of them, despite the huge risks, are making money that they keep coming back. Right. And even under sanctions, I feel like most Chinese companies aren't really aware of UN resolutions or
they can fly under the radar
regulations.
Operate under the radar of sanctions, these small
investors. Well, it's not even that under the radar. If you go to NK News, you can see a trade fair from a couple of weeks ago. Hundreds of booths, mostly Chinese companies.
Right.
I've talked to some, and I've said, under UN rules, you can't import any metal into this country, right? And they're like, what? No, that can't be right. So,
Yeah.
I would add Orascom, this
Yeah.
Egyptian telecom company, because
Orascom,
because they recently got the exemption from the UN Security Council, so they can keep their business in North Korea.
They can't get their money out, though, right?
Right. That's a huge headache for them, because at first they were so excited that their chairman Saudis had dinner with Kim Jong-il and got the personal blessing from the dear leader. But and Orascom their investment was one of the single largest investment made by foreign companies. But because of this foreign exchange rate issue, I mean, first of all, they're not allowed to convert their cash deposits into hard currency. The cash deposit amounts to the hundreds of millions of dollars now, but they're not allowed to convert it and even retrieve it and get back to their home country. And the problem is, you don't know exactly what amount you have, because the amount was calculated at the official exchange rates. But if you apply the black market exchange rates, then the amount just reduced dramatically. That's one big problem. And North Korea is doing a kind of a nasty trick, because you have Korea Link, where Orascom has 75% stakes, but North Korea, they established a new cell phone service provider wholly owned by the government, and they're trying to downgrade the call quality of Korea Link to shift the subscribers from Korea Link to Pyong, run by the government. This is nasty trick, but kind of natural conclusion by the government, because they don't want to see Orascom take the profits back to their country. So if you don't address this kind of problem, then whether it is sanctioned or non-sanctioned North Korea, any foreign direct investment would be destined to fail in North Korea.
Well, how are these Chinese investors getting their money back out of the country?
Samsonite suitcases. You have to be very crafty. It's a environment where the rules are not set, and your relationships matter more than everything, and it's extremely difficult. But a lot of these people built their businesses under similarly difficult conditions, right? So often people ask, like, would you invest in Korea? And I'm like, oh, I'm not crafty enough for that. You have to be before sanctions. I'm not.
Did the Chinese investors like dominate any sectors like mining or textiles? I mean, when North Korea was shipping out all these textiles before sanctions, at least according to the official data, or anthracite coal, who were the investors? Who built up the capacity? Were they Chinese, or was it North Korean money?
Mostly Chinese. So Chinese. There's a lot of joint ventures. They're the ones making better quality products. The ones with the resources to refurbish mines that were destroyed in the 1990s. And this causes some consternation in the South, right? The South Koreans in the last few years have increasingly been thinking we should be in there helping extract these resources, and instead we've abrogated it to the Chinese. Yeah.
Maybe we can conclude with how are the sanctions affecting marketization? And we're getting some idea it's not affecting some type of investment into North Korea. But what's your take on Andray, of the effect of sanctions on North Korea's marketization and economy?
I had the chance to live in Myanmar for a couple of years, and I wrote a book comparing North Korea and Myanmar, asking how Myanmar managed to return to the international community while North Korea remains isolated. Available at fine. Okay. So what we saw in Myanmar, which might be instructive, is it entered a period of marketization. It was a socialist command economy until 1988, and then they began the process of marketization at the same time as they also became sanctioned never by the UN, but primarily by the US and others. And what we saw develop was an economic environment that was extremely tough, and you could only really survive if you were very, very close to the state. You had to be really embedded with the military men in order to do well. And there's a very good study by a Japanese professor, Kudo Toshiyoshi, and he observed that following a sanctions event in 2003, where the US banned importation of textiles, 75% of small textile companies in Myanmar went out of business within 3 or 4 years, whereas the bigger textile companies increased their market share and survived. And so what I worry about in this current environment, if sanctions don't bring us to the table with the North Koreans and are not traded for something and just end up on for another decade the way they are today, I think we're really going to cripple the smaller actors in the economy, the kinds of actors I think we're looking to empower, and the only survivors will be the really big state-owned enterprises.
Okay. I agree with him, because even before there was a heavy sanctions imposed on North Korea, because of this marketization progressing, the scale of business has been growing, so that the old sales strategy of seeking profits from the regional price differences only is not competitive enough. And now the winning sales strategy is a kind of small profits and quick returns. So the Donju, we don't know who they are, but when they're running their own trucks, they want to expand the trade volume. So that means the smaller merchants, they have less and less room for them to make profits. And if you add on top of that sanctions, then there's much less chance for them to survive.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it seems to me, and you were talking about it in your paper on the logistics revolution. to get your excuse me, I'm using the term donju, to get for a donju to get his goods from point A to point B, he has to go through a couple of checkpoints and pay bribes. And if you pay the right bribe, you might be good for a year, and then you have to top it up the following year. So this marketization from below, it seems to me that the characteristics is, one, it's very inefficient, and two, it leads to a lot of corruption, or just fosters corruption. In fact, the World Bank actually does surveys on corruption in every country that I think is a member of the United Nations. So North Korea is not in the World Bank, but it's a member of the UN. And North Korea is at the very bottom. In fact, Cuba is like clean as a whistle compared to North Korea, even though both of them are, I think, the only economies that are a lot of similarities, more than any other two economies, I think. So that's how I would characterize marketization. How would you characterize it, Andray? What are the main features of marketization in North Korea?
It is a real shift in the social contract, I would say. So in the old system, you really could rely on the state to provide everything for you, so long as you followed the rules and did your job and followed the party line. And now some of that still exists. There's still, socialism in North Korea is still real, and it's still expected that the state will provide education and healthcare. But decreasingly, it's expected that the state will provide you a job that you can support your family on. You need money now. Every family needs money to survive. And so that's been a big shift. And I think we're still in this long process of the state renegotiating its social contract with its citizens. It's not finished by any means.
So there's no donju hospitals or schools yet?
I mean, there are hospitals for elites, and then there are, dilapidated hospitals far from Pyongyang in the countryside. And
maybe we'll get into that next week. Yeah. How would you summarize or characterize this marketization in North Korea?
Very ambivalent attitude from the people, I would add, because I read a column by a famous Korean scholar focusing on the North Korean economy, and he said, when you ask defectors to choose between Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un as their greatest, best economic leader, the defectors would say Kim Il-sung, because back then the public distribution system worked relatively well, and they didn't really have to worry about their daily survival. But when you ask them, then do you want to go back to Kim Il-sung era? Then they said no, because they don't want to give up on the market where they can have the potential to be rich, and they really want to stay as an individual market player. So it's kind of ambivalent, but again, the trend is already there, and the movement of people, products, and information and money, I think, have reached the kind of a irreversible level, and Kim Jong-un understands that.
Right. Yeah, those sentiments I heard expressed in the early years of the Russian Federation, when it was really tough and chaotic, that life was better under communism.
A young North Korean in Pyongyang once told me that Kim Il-sung made us ideologically strong, and Kim Jong-il made us militarily strong. So now Kim Jong-un can make us economically strong.
Yeah.
So,
well, as soon as they go to the IMF, that will happen.
Yeah. Okay. There are some steps. Yeah.
So thank you all for coming here, and I always like to put in a plug for membership in the Korea Society. So it helps us have these programs, and we do fly people in from various destinations, or take the train up from Washington, whatever. So we do have costs associated with these programs. So if you can keep that in mind, we'd appreciate that. And next week, again, we have the trauma care in North Korea. So I think we'll also be talking about marketization there as well. So thanks for coming.